Hi, thanks for joining me for another lecture on the Old Testament, this one on the United Monarchy period, covering particularly the kings Solomon and Rehoboam. To place this in context, again, we're talking about the period between period number 5. This is the second part of our consideration of the United Monarchy. This covers the first 11 chapters of the book of 1 Kings. Again, in the Hebrew Bible, Kings is all one book. In the English Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings. So King Solomon, his story is told. The narrative covers 1 Kings 1 through 11, and also 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. We'll talk a little bit later about the place of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, so just kind of hold that on the back burner for now. Solomon was the second of David and Bathsheba's sons, which means then that he was not the oldest of David's sons. Generally, the oldest was the king, but not in this particular case. And again, the genre for this literature is historical narrative. It is not history for history's sake. It's written for theological purposes, and it's important for us to keep in mind that no matter how wonderful David was, or Saul, or Samuel, or anybody else, Yahweh is always the hero of the narratives. It's all about who God is and what He has done and what He wants us to learn from that. So the reign of Solomon, I'm going to guess if we were face to face, could ask you about a couple of things that Solomon is known for, and my guess is that one of them would be his request for wisdom. God came to him in a vision, a dream, in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, and said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. In verse 5, wow, talk about a blank check. And Solomon says, I am a young man. I'm only a little child. I don't know how to carry out my duties. Please give me wisdom. And this word wisdom is used many times in the Old Testament and has a wide range of possible meanings. But in this setting, I think primarily what Solomon is asking for is administrative skill. And God, in response to this humble request, also then provides great riches. We're told in chapter 4, verse 20, that the people were happy. It was a time of great peace and contentment in the land of Israel. But the wisdom also extended to where Solomon wrote songs. He wrote Proverbs, small p, was very interested in plant and animal life, and wrote descriptions of the phenomena he observed there. Greatly expanded the kingdom's territory. But that also meant he greatly expanded his government. And there's a fascinating piece in chapter 4, verses 22 and 23 that describes the daily provisions required for his court. And it included, verse 23, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, and so on. That gives you an idea of how many people were being fed at his court. The second theme that we would probably immediately associate with Solomon is the temple. And here's an artist's reconstruction of the temple as built by Solomon, based on the description in 1 Kings. You see, it's much more elaborate than the tabernacle was. Some things for us to notice about the temple. David was the one who collected the materials, and then Solomon supervised the construction. David wanted to build the temple, but God said no. And later in Scripture, the indication is because he was a man of war. Solomon entered into a partnership with Hiram, the king of Sidon, to provide cedar beams, planks for the construction of the temple. And we're told in chapter 5 of 1 Kings that there was a workforce of 30,000 Israelite men. 10,000 were on the job in any given month, so you were on the job 1 month and at home for 2 months, the text tells us. Big project. An interesting statement in chapter 6, verse 7 is that the preparatory work was done off-site so that there would be no sound of hammering at the temple itself and in the temple. It was seen as a place of reverence. And all of this was a continuation of God's promise to David. And that's stated clearly in chapter 6, verses 11 to 13. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, carry out my regulations, and keep my commandments and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father. And I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. So the dedication of the temple is described in great detail in chapter 8. The Ark of the Covenant was delivered to the temple first thing, and that event brings about the glory of Yahweh filling the temple. Verse 10 of chapter 8, when the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. Almost identical language to what we see in the book of Exodus as far as the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle. Same language, cloud, glory, Shekinah. The balance of chapter 8, starting at verse 22, is Solomon's lengthy prayer of dedication. An opportunity to learn, to be challenged by, to be instructed by how the men and women of Scripture prayed. He begins with reminders of Yahweh's covenant faithfulness, how God has taken care of them. He goes all the way back, talking about his faithfulness to David. And then there's a lengthy section pleading that God would hear the prayers of his people, particularly when they are in distress. There's kind of a pattern here that says, when this happens to your people and they turn their face to Jerusalem, toward the temple, and they pray, please answer and relieve their distress. And there's several scenarios that he lays out in that section, 31 through 52. And then the prayer closes with a blessing and a call for the people to be obedient to this loving God. Just a remarkable prayer. Solomon's an example of someone who starts well but does not finish well. We have these amazing encounters that he has with God. Two of them, the first and the third on this list, chapter 3 and chapter 9, are actual visible appearances from God. The one in chapter 6 just says the word of the Lord came to him. But a visual representation, a visible presence of God, and each time there is an exhortation to obedience. If you will obey me, if you'll obey me, I'll do these things. It's a condition for receiving God's promises. And it's easy to look at that and say, how could you do anything but be obedient? Well, didn't happen that way, did it? And the big problem, I think we could say, is the foreign wives. Now, Solomon entered into these marriages for political and economic reasons. But part of the agreement when doing so was that these women were to have access for their own worship. He was to build for them a place of worship. So eventually what we see is that these wives, this multiplicity of wives, a multiplicity of places of worship for them, in chapter 11 we're told that sadly that turned Solomon's heart to other gods, even to the point, in verse 7, it says, on the hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Amazing change of perspective for Solomon. And Yahweh's words of judgment, which follow there in chapter 11, verses 9 through 13, those words set the stage as the narrative reveals Solomon's adversaries or opponents. The primary of those adversaries is Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So upon the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam becomes the next king. And I call your attention to Samuel's prediction back in 1 Samuel 8:11 through 18, when the people wanted a king, and Samuel said, well, this is what it will cost you. And sure enough, the people come to Rehoboam and they ask for relief from those very factors that Samuel identified. They ask for relief from conscription. They ask for relief from the forced labor. They ask for relief from the eminent domain, the seizure of their property. And they especially ask for relief from the taxation. They say, please make it better for us, I guess you could say. Please ease up. So Rehoboam does a wise thing. He seeks counsel. And we're told in chapter 12, verses 1 through 15, that he goes first to the elder statesmen, those who had advised his father. And their advice to him is to say, ease up, and you will have the loyalty of these people forever. So Rehoboam essentially says, okay, thank you very much. Let me ask my friends, his young friends, his friends from childhood, who I suspect had been eating at Solomon's table all these years. And they say to him, oh no, you must be tough, make it even harder for them. And of course, Rehoboam takes the second set of advisory words. And Jeroboam leads then the northern tribes into secession, and he became their king. And that's all described for us here in chapter 12, the response to Rehoboam's foolishness. Let's step aside for just a moment and talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible is all one book, Chronicles, just like Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, but the English Bible divides each of those into 2 books. And it parallels the accounts in 1st and 2nd King, for the 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, historically, but presents those accounts from a different perspective. Good illustration of historical narrative with theological purpose. Focus on the life of David in 1st Chronicles, but 2nd Chronicles then, the narrative begins with building the temple, with Solomon's reign and building the temple. And 2nd Chronicles then closes with the edict of the Gentile king to rebuild the temple. So certainly in 2nd Chronicles, temple is a pretty crucial part of the orientation of that book. Scholars are fairly well agreed that this book was written in the post-exilic period, when, although the people had been promised renewal and restoration in the land, they really didn't have much at hand. Whatever temple had been rebuilt, was nothing compared to the grandeur of the old temple. So the writer of Chronicles is retelling the past to inspire hope in the present. God was at work then. He will continue to be at work now. Theologically, what you will see in Chronicles, much more than in Samuel and Kings, is the centrality, or the validation rather, of the priests as community leaders. You get a lot more information about the priests in Chronicles. Emphasis there on the centrality of temple worship. And then also, the works of David and Solomon are idealized. There's nothing in this account about the sin with Bathsheba, and also when the kings are described, it's only the kings in the south. There's no attention at all to the kings in the north. All right, let's wrap this up with some themes related particularly to Solomon. Probably, as we've mentioned, one of the themes that runs through all of these books, both Samuel and Kings, is obedience to the covenant. It's part of the condition of giving these promises. Is just what God expects of His people. especially the leaders. Certainly the temple is a crucial piece of the presentation here, particularly about Solomon. His name is always connected with the temple. There's a traditional connection between Solomon and the wisdom literature for the writing of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, Song of Songs. It's traditionally been attributed to Solomon. There's much scholarly disagreement about that at this time, but we can understand why there would be that connection. But I also want to pose another theme. It's not explicit in this writing about Solomon, but certainly we see a change in leadership orientation. David was raised as a shepherd, and his orientation as a leader was more that of the shepherd, which I believe is the one consistent leadership image throughout both the Old and New Testament, is the leader as shepherd. So David brought that to the kingship, but certainly Solomon did not. Solomon was raised in the court, and gives us no indication that that's really part of his orientation. And certainly the outcome of his leadership was not, didn't represent a shepherding orientation. So that's a pretty quick look at the United Monarchy period following the time of David. Hope it's been helpful to you, and hope that perhaps it's given you encouragement to look a little more deeply into these scriptures yourselves. Thanks.